A man stood on a wooden scaffold in the cold January air of 1606. His name was Guy Fawkes, and in just a few moments, his body would be ripped apart in one of the most excruciating executions ever devised in English history. Forget the popular image of bonfires and fireworks on November 5th. What actually happened to Guy Fawkes after the failed Gunpowder Plot was far more disturbing. This is not a story of quick justice. This is a story of a slow, public, carefully staged death that no modern person could endure. The crowd had gathered early that morning outside Westminster. They knew what was coming. Executions weren't private events. They were community spectacles, a brutal mix of justice, entertainment, and warning. But this wasn't just any criminal being punished. Guy Fawkes had been part of a conspiracy to blow up Parliament and kill the king. That meant his punishment had to match the scale of the crime. And in early 17th century England, treason carried the most infamous penalty of all: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The phrase is so well known today that it almost sounds abstract, like some medieval cliché. But for the people who actually watched it, it was horrifyingly real. And the process wasn't just about killing someone, it was about breaking them down, piece by piece, until they were stripped of every shred of humanity. First came the humiliation. Guy Fawkes and the other captured plotters were paraded through the streets on hurdles, wooden frames dragged behind horses. The men were tied down flat, faces exposed to the crowd, forced to endure jeers, insults, and sometimes stones or filth hurled from spectators. This wasn't transportation, it was degradation. By the time Fawkes reached the scaffold, his dignity had already been shredded. But that was only the beginning. Standing on the platform, he would have seen the instruments of execution waiting: a gallows, a chopping block, and a collection of knives and hooks ready for what came after. For treason, the sentence was carried out in stages. It began with hanging, not the long drop designed to snap the neck quickly. That method came later. In 1606, hanging was deliberately slow. The condemned was hoisted by the neck and left to choke. The rope cut off the airways, blood rushed to the head, and the lungs screamed for oxygen. The body thrashed, the chest heaved, and the eyes bulged. Death, however, was not the goal. The executioner had to watch carefully and cut the rope before the prisoner slipped away completely. The purpose was not mercy. It was to make sure the condemned was still alive for the real punishment. This is the part most people today can't wrap their heads around. Guy Fawkes wasn't executed in a single stroke. He was dismantled. Once cut down from the gallows, gasping and barely conscious, the condemned was drawn. This part of the phrase referred to being disemboweled in front of the crowd. The executioner would slice open the abdomen, remove the entrails, and burn them on a brazier right there on the scaffold. It wasn't symbolic, it was literal, physical destruction of the body, while the victim could still feel it. Imagine the sight: smoke rising from the fire as parts of the human body were roasted in public view, the stench mixing with the winter air, and the crowd reacting with gasps, shouts, and even laughter. For the authorities, this wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was a theater. The message was clear: betray the crown, and this is what happens. Finally came the quartering. After the intestines and organs were gone, the executioner finished the work by decapitating the prisoner and hacking the body into 4 sections. Each piece was displayed on spikes or city gates as a warning to others. The head of Guy Fawkes, like his fellow conspirators, would be mounted on a pole for all to see. But here's where the story of Guy Fawkes takes a twist that separates him from the others. According to accounts, as he stood on the scaffold that day, he made one last defiant move. Weak from torture and knowing what awaited him, Fawkes jumped. Instead of waiting for the rope to strangle him slowly, he threw himself from the platform, snapping his neck instantly. It was his final act of resistance, a way of denying the crowd, the king, and the executioner the full spectacle they craved. In a single motion, he escaped the agony of being butchered alive. The executioners still went through the motions. His body was quartered, his remains displayed, But Fawkes himself never felt the full extent of what had been planned. That decision, that leap, is one of the most haunting moments in the entire story, because it forces us to imagine the unbearable reality of what he avoided, the pain of suffocation, the shock of being cut open, the horror of watching your own body destroyed in front of thousands. Fawkes chose the instant over the ordeal, and in that choice, he left behind one of the most chilling footnotes in English history. But the gruesome ending is only one part of the story. To understand why it had to be so brutal, you need to understand the fear it was meant to address. The Gunpowder Plot wasn't just a crime, it was a national trauma. 12 men had conspired to blow up the king, his family, the lords and the commons in a single blast. If they had succeeded, the government of England would have been decapitated in one morning. The country would have been thrown into chaos, civil war, and religious bloodshed. When the plot was discovered, it wasn't enough to simply execute the conspirators. The state needed to make an example so terrifying that no one would dare attempt something similar. Public executions had always been warnings, but in the case of treason, they became propaganda. The execution of Guy Fawkes was a performance designed to burn itself into the memory of every person who saw it, and every person who heard about it afterward, and it worked. Even today, more than 4 centuries later, the name of Guy Fawkes is remembered. His execution wasn't meant to be forgotten. It was meant to echo through time. Of course, there's irony here. The man who tried to blow up Parliament ended up becoming the center of a national ritual. Every year, effigies of Guy Fawkes are burned on bonfires across Britain. Fireworks explode in the sky, a twisted celebration of the very thing he tried to achieve with gunpowder. But what the celebrations don't capture is the raw, visceral horror of his real death. The man behind the mask wasn't just a failed conspirator, he was the victim of one of history's most brutal forms of justice. And this raises a question that lingers long after the smoke clears. What does it mean when a society turns execution into spectacle? Was it justice, or was it something darker, an appetite for violence dressed up as law? That question is why the story of Guy Fawkes still captivates, still unsettles, and still sparks conversation today. Guy Fawkes didn't begin life as a traitor. He was born in York in 1570, to a fairly ordinary family, though one detail of his childhood would prove crucial. His parents were Catholic in a country that had outlawed Catholicism. England under Queen Elizabeth I, and later King James I, was a Protestant nation. Catholic priests were hunted, Catholic families fined, and Catholic worship pushed underground. To grow up in that environment meant learning early what it felt like to live on the margins of society. When Fawkes was 8, his father died. His mother remarried, and her new husband was connected to prominent Catholic families. Through them, Guy Fawkes became deeply tied to the Catholic cause. For many young men in his position, the frustration wasn't just religious, it was political. They saw Protestant England as oppressive, and Spain, the great Catholic power of Europe, as a potential liberator. It was this loyalty to Catholicism that led Fawkes to fight in the 80 Years' War. He traveled to the Spanish Netherlands and joined the Spanish army, fighting against Protestant rebels. He gained a reputation as a skilled soldier, and perhaps more importantly, an expert in explosives. It was this experience with gunpowder that would later make him so valuable to the men who dreamed of blowing up Parliament. By the time he returned to England, the stage was set. Catholics were still persecuted. James I, despite initial hopes of tolerance, enforced harsh restrictions, and a small group of Catholic conspirators began to believe that only one act could turn the tide: kill the king, wipe out the government in one strike, and restore Catholic rule with the help of a sympathetic monarch. That idea became the Gunpowder Plot. The plan was deceptively simple: plant barrels of gunpowder beneath the House of Lords and detonate them on the day of the state opening of Parliament, when the king, the royal family, and the leading nobles would all be present. With one explosion, the entire ruling class of England would be destroyed. Robert Catesby was the mastermind, but he needed someone who knew how to handle explosives. That's where Guy Fawkes came in. He wasn't the leader, but he was the technician, the man who would light the fuse. The conspirators rented a cellar directly beneath Parliament. Over months they smuggled in 36 barrels of gunpowder, hiding them under piles of firewood. The sheer scale of it was staggering. If ignited, the explosion would have leveled the building and killed hundreds in an instant. Historians still debate whether the amount of powder was even necessary. It might have been enough to destroy half of Westminster, but no matter how carefully planned, conspiracies are fragile things. Rumors spread. Letters were sent. One anonymous warning, delivered to a member of Parliament, was enough to unravel everything. On the night of November 4th, 1605, guards searched the cellars beneath the building. There they found Guy Fawkes cloaked and armed with a lantern, guarding the barrels of powder. In that moment, the plot collapsed. Fawkes was seized, interrogated, and taken to the Tower of London, and it was there that the next chapter of his ordeal began. The chapter that explains why he looked so broken on the scaffold weeks later. The Tower of London was not just a prison, it was a place where information was extracted by any means necessary. Torture was officially regulated by the monarch's permission, and in the case of Guy Fawkes, King James I gave his approval. The king wanted names. He wanted the entire conspiracy exposed. At first, Fawkes resisted. He gave a false name, John Johnson, and claimed to be nothing more than a servant. His cool defiance impressed even his enemies, but resistance could only last so long. The records show the methods. First came lighter tortures, the manacles. His wrists were chained behind him, and he was suspended, forcing the full weight of his body onto his shoulders. The pain grew unbearable as muscles tore and joints threatened to dislocate, but Fawkes still held out. Then came the rack, one of the most feared devices in the tower. It was designed to pull the body apart. The prisoner was laid out, wrists and ankles tied to rollers. As the handle turned, the ropes tightened, stretching the body beyond its natural limits. Tendons tore, joints cracked, and muscles ripped. The agony was so intense that even the strongest men eventually broke, and so did Guy Fawkes. His first confession was brief, but as the days went on and the torture continued, more names slipped out. His handwriting tells the story. The first signature, firm and defiant. The latter one, trembling, barely legible, scrawled by a man whose body had been wrecked. The transformation was so stark that historians still use those signatures as evidence of what torture can do. By the time he was dragged into court with the surviving conspirators, he was a shadow of the soldier he had once been. The trial was a formality. The verdict had already been decided. Guilty of high treason, the sentence to be hanged, drawn and quartered. But the trial, like the execution, was not just about punishment, it was about theater. The judges, the crown, and the public all needed to see the plotters humbled, broken, and made examples of, and that's why the execution that followed was staged with such gruesome detail. Still, what makes Fawkes' story resonate isn't just the brutality of his death, it's the clash between his defiance and his downfall. Even after torture, even after betrayal, he managed one last gesture on the scaffold, the leap that denied the full spectacle. That act complicates his legacy. Was he a fanatic who nearly plunged England into chaos, or a man whose courage, however misdirected, never completely deserted him? And this is why the story endures. The bonfires and fireworks are one version of Guy Fawkes, a caricature of treason defeated. The real version is darker. It's about a man crushed between faith and politics, between loyalty and violence, between the cruelty of his captors and his own choice to end it swiftly. The crowd that watched his body quartered in 1606 couldn't have imagined that centuries later, his face would become a symbol. From effigies burned on village greens to masks worn by protesters around the world, Guy Fawkes remains a figure, both reviled and admired. And it all began with those moments of pain, spectacle, and final defiance on the scaffold. The execution of Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators didn't just end a plot, it became a political message carved into the collective memory of England. The government wanted to be sure that every subject, from the highest noble to the poorest farmer, understood what treason meant, not in theory, but in flesh and blood. The spectacle did its job. News of the executions spread across the country with speed, carried in proclamations, sermons, and rumors. For many, the details were repeated around hearths and marketplaces, each retelling painting the plotters as both villains and cautionary examples. The government didn't just punish a handful of men. It staged a warning for generations, and the warning didn't end with their deaths. The fragments of their bodies, mounted on spikes, stared down from city walls and bridges long after the executions. Imagine crossing London Bridge and seeing a human head slowly decaying above you. It was impossible to forget, impossible to ignore. The message was constant. Loyalty to the crown is survival. Betrayal is annihilation. But this brutality raised a deeper issue. If the state needed such savagery to enforce loyalty, what did that say about the unity of the kingdom itself? The Gunpowder Plot revealed not just the desperation of a group of Catholic conspirators, but the fractures in English society. Fractures that violence alone couldn't mend. The government responded not just with punishment, but with legislation. Laws against Catholics became harsher. Attending Catholic Mass carried heavier fines. Catholic priests were hunted with renewed zeal. Land ownership, inheritance, and education were all restricted for Catholic families. The very execution that was meant to deter rebellion also deepened the persecution that had fueled it. For those who lived under these laws, the death of Guy Fawkes was not just a warning. It was a sentence that echoed across their daily lives. And yet the memory of the plot evolved in a direction no one could have predicted. Almost immediately, November 5th was declared a day of thanksgiving for the deliverance of the king. Churches rang bells, sermons were preached, and bonfires were lit in celebration. People burned effigies of the Pope, a symbolic gesture of Protestant triumph. Over time, those effigies shifted. By the late 17th century, it wasn't the Pope on the fire but Guy Fawkes himself. The transformation was striking. A failed conspirator who tried to blow up Parliament became the very figure burned year after year in villages and towns. Children carried Guys through the streets, begging for pennies to buy fireworks. A penny for the Guy became part of the ritual, embedding his name in English culture far more deeply than any of his fellow plotters. Here lies one of the strangest twists of history. The government tried to erase treason with terror, but in doing so, it immortalized the traitor. Guy Fawkes became folklore. His death, intended as a deterrent, turned into an annual celebration where fire, not rope, became the symbol. Of course, the real horror of his execution was sanitized in the process. Bonfire night was festive. Families gathered around flames, fireworks lit the skies, and the gruesome details of entrails and quartered limbs faded into the background. The children chanting, "Remember, remember the 5th of November," remembered the plot, but not the agony of the scaffold. The ritual stripped away the gore and replaced it with sparks and laughter. But history has a way of circling back. Centuries later, the image of Guy Fawkes would re-emerge, not as an effigy to be burned, but as a mask to be worn. In the 1980s, the comic V for Vendetta transformed him into a symbol of resistance, a man who stood against tyranny. The mask, popularized further by films and adopted by protest movements worldwide, became a shorthand for rebellion. Anonymous, Occupy, countless demonstrations across the globe. The irony is impossible to miss. Guy Fawkes, once paraded as the face of ultimate betrayal, became the face of protest against power. His leap from the scaffold, meant to escape the agony of execution, turned into a leap into immortality. Still, it's important to remember the historical man behind the mask. Guy Fawkes was not a comic book hero. He wasn't a freedom fighter for democracy. He was a soldier who joined a plot to kill hundreds in pursuit of a religious and political cause. His story is complicated, entangled in fanaticism, oppression, and desperation. To see him only as a villain, or only as a hero, is to miss the depth of what happened in 1605. And perhaps that's why his story endures. It raises questions we still wrestle with today. What drives people to extremism? How does a state balance security with justice? When punishment becomes spectacle, is it justice or intimidation? These questions don't belong only to the past. They echo in modern headlines, in debates about terrorism, in arguments over surveillance and control. The execution of Guy Fawkes is not just a relic of history, it's a mirror. Imagine for a moment, standing in that crowd in 1606. The winter air is biting your face. The cries of the condemned, the crack of the rope, the hiss of burning entrails, the cheer as the axe falls. How would you feel? Vindicated, horrified, or simply entertained, like the thousands who gathered not out of duty, but curiosity. That's the unsettling truth of these spectacles. They thrived because people came to watch. They were as much about public appetite as royal authority. And in that sense, the death of Guy Fawkes tells us as much about the crowd as it does about the man on the scaffold. From that scaffold to today's protests, his shadow lingers, fireworks crackle, effigies burn, masks cover faces in streets far removed from 17th century England. And every time the name Guy Fawkes is spoken, the memory of that gruesome execution flickers, even if only faintly, beneath the smoke and celebration. Because in the end, his death was not just a punishment, it was a performance, one that succeeded beyond anything the executioner or the king could have imagined. The execution of Guy Fawkes was not an isolated moment. It was part of a chain of punishments that swept up every conspirator the authorities could catch. In the days after the failed plot, Robert Catesby and several others died in a shootout with the king's men. But those who survived faced the same gruesome fate. One by one, they were dragged through the streets, jeered at by the crowd and hauled to the scaffold. The sentence was identical: hanging, drawing, and quartering. Each man endured the same ritual humiliation, the same half-death on the rope, the same disemboweling flames, and the same final butchery. If one conspirator's end had been enough to terrify the public, the repeated spectacle drove the point home even harder. Thomas Percy, Ambrose Rookwood, Robert Keyes, they each met the same end. Their families, their friends, and anyone even suspected of sympathy felt the weight of the punishment. The government wasn't just executing men, it was stamping out a cause, crushing the idea that Catholic rebellion could ever succeed. Yet the cruelty of the executions had another effect. It drew a line in the memory of the people. The conspirators were destroyed, but their story was never forgotten. Treason trials and executions had happened before, but rarely with this much spectacle, rarely with so much emphasis on the horror of the body itself. The plot had been a national crisis. The execution became a national performance. What happened afterward is almost as telling as the executions themselves. The fragments of the plotters were scattered across England as warnings. Heads spiked on London Bridge, limbs nailed to gates. The public passed beneath them daily, reminded of the cost of treason, but time has a way of dulling the fear. Months passed, then years, and the gruesome displays rotted away. What remained was not the flesh, but the memory, and that memory began to shift. For Protestants, the story of Guy Fawkes became proof of divine deliverance. Sermons thundered that God himself had saved the king from destruction. For Catholics, the story was more complex. Fawkes and his companions were not universally admired. Many Catholic leaders condemned the plot as reckless, but for others, the suffering of the conspirators became a symbol of resistance, however misguided. This duality shaped the legacy. Guy Fawkes was both villain and martyr, depending on who told the tale, and over centuries the edges blurred. He transformed from a specific man into a broader idea, one that could be burned, celebrated, mocked, or even idolized. Bonfire night cemented that transformation. Children begged in the streets, dragging effigies stuffed with straw. The cry of a penny for the Guy turned Fawkes into a puppet of folklore. The effigies grew grotesque, sometimes more caricature than man, and as fireworks lit the skies, few paused to remember the scaffold, the rack, the blood in the sawdust. The reality faded into legend, and legend into ritual. But if the ritual softened the horror is still there for anyone who looks closely. The story of Guy Fawkes is not just about one man's failure. It's about the machinery of power, the weight of belief, and the lengths a state will go to defend itself. His execution shows us a society where justice and cruelty walked hand in hand, where the spectacle of death was used as a tool of control, And here is the thought that lingers: would we today be any different if placed in that world? If you stood in that crowd in 1606, would you have turned away in disgust, or would you have shouted with the rest as the axe fell? History has a way of exposing not just the past, but the uncomfortable truths about human nature. Guy Fawkes leapt from the scaffold to avoid the slow torture of his sentence, but he couldn't escape the legacy that followed. His name, his mask, his fire, these live on centuries later. His execution was supposed to erase him, but in the end, it ensured he would never be forgotten. And maybe that is the deepest irony of all. The state intended to make an example of him, and it did, but not in the way it imagined. Every November, flames rise across Britain, not just in memory of a failed plot, but in echo of a man whose death was too spectacular, too gruesome, too unforgettable to disappear. So when the fireworks crackle and the effigies burn, remember the real ending. Remember the scaffold, the rope, the final leap, and the silence that followed. Remember the man who faced one of history's most excruciating punishments and chose to meet it on his own terms. And then ask yourself, was Guy Fawkes a warning or a ghost that refuses to be silenced?